The story of Edward Kawak begins long before the bright stage lights and perfect poses we're used to seeing. He was born on February 28, 1959, in the city of Zal, Lebanon, a place marked by heavy political tension and the chaos of civil war. Imagine growing up surrounded by uncertainty, hearing every day the sounds of conflicts that shaped an entire generation. That was the harsh and unpredictable environment where Edward took his first steps, learning early on that nothing in life would come easy. In that climate of instability, his family had to hold on to values that would later become essential to his character. Discipline, courage, and resilience weren't just nice virtues. They were survival tools. Every day demanded emotional strength and determination, and those qualities would shape the personality of that young Lebanese boy in a profound way. As the years went by, it became clear that Lebanon wasn't a safe or promising place for a young man with big dreams. So, still very young, Edward found himself facing a tough decision: stay in the chaos or search for a new life far from home. That's when the opportunity arose for him to move to France, in hopes of stability and, maybe, a more dignified future. When Edward arrived in France, he found a world completely different from the one he knew. Safety, structure, and new opportunities fueled a deep transformation. For someone who had grown up surrounded by fear and uncertainty, discovering a place where he could dream without constantly looking over his shoulder must have felt like an indescribable relief. Edward's arrival in France opened doors he never imagined. It was there, in the 1970s, that he stepped into a gym for the first time, still without fully understanding what bodybuilding even was. The young Lebanese refugee was simply looking for strength, health, and a sense of control over his own life. But little by little, that routine of weights, sweat, and silence became something much bigger, a true passion. In the beginning, Kawak trained with no expectations, just testing his physical limits. But it quickly became obvious that there was something special about him. His gifted genetics responded to training in an incredible way. Every muscle grew with rare symmetry, and his aesthetics stood out even before he had any professional experience. It was as if his body had been built for this sport. With encouragement from friends and coaches, Edward began entering local competitions. And to the surprise of many, he stood out right from his first appearances. Even without mastering all the posing techniques yet, his structure spoke for itself. Crowds recognized the natural harmony in his physique, while judges saw an athlete with potential for something far greater. As he evolved, he was invited to larger competitions, and it didn't take long for his rise to become inevitable. It was in the NABBA, one of the strongest federations in Europe, that he truly shined. Edward dominated the stage with ease, winning world championships and catching the attention of everyone who followed the sport. When Edward finally entered the international scene, bodybuilding was going through a phase of change, rivalry, and aesthetic evolution. And it was between 1982 and 1993 that he established himself as a true legend within the NABBA. During that period, Kawak became a name that was nearly impossible to ignore. His physique combined density, balance, and stage presence, a rare mix that captivated judges, fans, and even other athletes. The streak of titles he collected was impressive. Between 1982 and 1985, Kawak won 4 consecutive editions of the prestigious NABBA Mr. Universe, an achievement reserved for only a handful of athletes in history. And as if that weren't enough, in 1993, he earned his 5th title, confirming his absolute dominance in the federation. That consistency and excellence placed him in a special category, securing his status as one of the greatest European bodybuilders of all time. Back then, Edward was considered by many to be the most aesthetic athlete of the early 80s. His body looked sculpted by hand, clean lines, broad shoulders, a tight waist, and muscles that combined size with almost surgical definition. In an era when classic aesthetics still mattered more than extreme mass, Kawak stood out as the embodiment of perfect physical balance. Comparisons with the IFBB's Mr. Olympia were inevitable. Side-by-side photos circulated in magazines and backstage conversations, and many analysts at the time believed Kawak displayed better aesthetics than several IFBB champions in multiple areas. That fueled a constant debate. What would have happened if Edward had moved to the IFBB? Could he have won the Olympia? That speculation has never stopped intriguing fans. The truth is, if Kawak had joined the main federation at the peak of his symmetry, he would have had a real chance of seriously fighting for an Olympia title. His early years in NABBA were so extraordinary that many people believe he would have been a direct threat to the biggest names of that era. After dominating NABBA for years and building an impeccable reputation throughout Europe, Edward felt it was time to take the step every champion dreams of, competing in the IFBB. In 1986, he made the move that seemed completely logical for anyone seeking global recognition. After all, the Olympia, the biggest stage in bodybuilding, belonged to the IFBB. For Kawak, that decision represented the chance to finally go head-to-head with the best in the world and earn the ultimate respect of the bodybuilding community. But what looked like the perfect move happened at the wrong moment. When Edward finally crossed into the IFBB, the federation already had a well-established structure, with long-standing athletes and a heavily political internal system. The transition wasn't nearly as simple as he expected. The environment was different, highly competitive, and often difficult for anyone coming from the outside. His talent ran into resistance right from the start. The shine he carried in NABBA didn't automatically translate into recognition in his new home. The reception was cold. Athletes who came from NABBA rarely received immediate attention, and Kawak was no exception. Even with an impressive physique, the IFBB valued other behind-the-scenes factors, relationships, internal history, and even commercial interests. The result? Edward had to start almost from scratch, as if his world titles meant nothing in this new territory. His contest results reflected that lack of support. In his Olympia debut in 1986, Kawak placed 8th, respectable, but far from the impact he once had in NABBA. The next year, he dropped to 13th. And in 1988, he didn't even appear in the top 15. For an athlete of Edward's caliber, such a fast decline was painful and hard to understand. It wasn't a physique issue, and it definitely wasn't lack of effort. It was the system quietly signaling that he wasn't part of the inner circle. Over time, Edward Kawak became a symbol of how internal politics and federation rivalries could bury entire careers. And his situation wasn't unique. In fact, it followed a pattern that had already affected other NABBA athletes. Names like Jeff King and John Turilli, both incredibly strong and aesthetic, also struggled to be accepted and valued in their new federation. It was as if the IFBB had an invisible barrier blocking those who weren't raised inside their own system. And even though these athletes had world-class physiques, the reception was always cold, bureaucratic, and often demotivating. This scenario became even more obvious years later when the WBF emerged to compete with the IFBB. Many athletes left the IFBB chasing better contracts, and when the WBF collapsed, they tried to return. And what happened? Immediate demotions, bad placings, closed doors everywhere. The message was clear. The IFBB didn't easily forgive those who crossed its boundaries or challenged its dominance. Given all that, it's easy to understand why so many fans and experts still believe Kawak was unfairly treated. After years of trying to establish himself in the IFBB and facing disappointing placings, Edward realized that environment would never give him the recognition he deserved. So in 1989, he made a strategic decision, returned to NABBA, the federation where he had built his legacy and won his greatest titles. And what happened afterward only confirmed what many already knew. Edward had never lost his shine. The moment he returned, he regained the confidence, the respect, and the spotlight he had always earned. Seeing him back on the NABBA stage felt almost like watching a king reclaim his throne. And in 1993, Kawak sealed that comeback by winning his 5th Mr. Universe title, a milestone achieved by very few bodybuilders in the history of the sport. That victory didn't just reinforce his greatness, it showed the world that he still had plenty to offer. Even so, the 1990s brought natural changes to his physique. His waist, once tight and perfectly balanced, became a little wider, and the overall muscle quality no longer resembled his early years of absolute dominance. The sport itself was changing too, shifting more and more toward sheer mass, and that shift affected athletes who valued classic aesthetics, like Edward. His final competitive appearance happened at the 1999 Masters Olympia, where he placed 13th. More than just a result, that moment symbolized the end of a chapter. What always stood out in Edward's physique wasn't just his aesthetic appeal, it was the perfect combination of raw power and total control over his own body. He wasn't just visually impressive, he was an absolute force of nature. Reports from the time say his bench press went over 220 kilograms, around 485 pounds, a feat very few bodybuilders of his generation could match. And in the squat, Edward pushed close to 362 kilograms, about 798 pounds, a number that shows just how insane his strength really was. Those massive lifts made it clear that behind that elegant physique was an athlete with extraordinary power. Kawak's back and legs were two of his biggest weapons. His back had a rare depth, combining thick, dense muscle with clean, well-defined lines. His legs looked like carved marble pillars, full of mass and deep cuts. Many athletes at the time talked about the shock of seeing Edward in person. His legs looked sculpted, with a muscle density that impressed even the most experienced judges. These strengths amplified his stage presence, giving every pose a mix of power and symmetry. As his career progressed, Edward Kawak stopped being just a standout bodybuilder and became a true public figure. His name began circulating not only among athletes and coaches, but also in fitness magazines, international gyms, and events around the world. In Europe and the Middle East, he quickly gained a legion of fans who saw something special in his physique, a rare blend of size, aesthetics, and presence. During the off-season, Kawak would easily reach around 120 kilograms, roughly 265 pounds, carrying a level of muscle volume that impressed even veteran athletes. That massive frame, combined with his long, rugged, unmistakable hair, gave rise to a nickname that stuck with him for years, Rambo. The resemblance to Sylvester Stallone wasn't just physical. There was something about his posture, his intensity, and the way he carried himself that reminded people of the action movie icon. Over time, Edward began appearing on the covers of popular fitness magazines. Publications across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East showcased his classic poses, celebrating his symmetry and muscle density. For many young athletes of that generation, seeing Kawak on a magazine cover was pure inspiration. These years of international visibility helped build his legacy far beyond the stage. Edward wasn't just a competitor. He became a recognizable face, a reference point, almost a cinematic figure within the world of classic bodybuilding. But as the years went by, the body that had carried Edward Kawak to the top of the sport began showing clear signs of wear. The constant pursuit of size, density, and extreme conditioning brought consequences he could no longer ignore. Cardiovascular problems began to appear, quiet but persistent. His kidneys and liver, organs extremely sensitive to long-term use of powerful substances, also started showing signs of strain. The athlete who once seemed unbreakable suddenly faced limitations no heavy training session could fix. Much of this decline was tied to the aggressive anabolic cycles common in his era, but especially intense among athletes chasing peak performance. Long-term use may have seriously affected his cardiovascular system, as well as compromised essential internal functions. Even though Kawak rarely spoke about it, people close to him knew he was dealing with challenges far beyond the daily brutality of training. Sources suggest Edward truly pushed his body to the limit. His lifestyle involved extremely strict diets, long periods of dehydration, and incredibly high-volume training. That combination, along with heavy steroid use, created a routine impossible to sustain long-term. Even so, Kawak approached it all with the same determination that had taken him to the top of NABBA. But unlike tragic stories such as that of Andreas Munzer, there are no records of a dramatic or public collapse in Edward's case. His decline was quiet, gradual, almost discreet. He kept showing up at events, competing occasionally, and maintaining his physique the best he could. That created the perception that he was still doing fine, when, in reality, his body had already been signaling for some time that things weren't working like before. On May 21, 2006, the bodybuilding world received news no one was prepared for. Edward Kawak had passed away, alone, in a hotel room in China, at just 47 years old. The official cause was a heart attack, an abrupt ending for an athlete who had seemed unbreakable for decades. For many fans, the news felt like a silent shock. Even far from the spotlight, Edward still carried the respect of those who remembered his prime, his flawless aesthetics, and the incredible strength that made him a legend across Europe. His early death raised questions and reflections about the toll of years of heavy training, extreme dieting, and aggressive substance cycles. But unlike more publicized cases, there was no long investigation or detailed revelations about his final days. Kawak's passing went almost unnoticed outside the bodybuilding world. His story wasn't deeply examined or turned into headlines. It was treated like a brief note, a technical report, as if his entire journey had been reduced to one cold, lonely line. That immediate fading from public memory reflected a sad reality within bodybuilding. The legacy of champions often depends on how visible they were within the most popular federations. Since Kawak never became a major figure inside the IFBB, his death didn't trigger international reaction. Specialized magazines mentioned it quickly, almost mechanically, and very few tributes were made to honor his impact. A man who shined so brightly, who dominated NABBA for so many years, ended up leaving this world without the recognition he deserved. Kawak's death leaves an uncomfortable question hanging in the air. How many athletes dedicate their entire lives to the sport, sacrificing health, time, and well-being, only to pass away without receiving the tribute they truly earned? Looking at bodybuilding's history, it's impossible to deny that Edward Kawak was one of NABBA's greatest names. His 5 Mr. Universe titles stand as undeniable proof of his greatness. And yet, when you look at today's discussions among fans, athletes, and content creators, something becomes painfully clear. Kawak's name almost never comes up. It's as if a dominant champion had slowly been erased from collective memory, buried under the brighter spotlight of larger federations and more media-friendly stars of his era. This absence in modern conversations isn't the result of a lack of talent, not at all. It's the direct consequence of poor career management and decisions made at the wrong time. His late transition to the IFBB, his struggle to adapt to the federation's political environment, and the lack of strategic backstage support all played a role in shrinking his global presence. Kawak had everything to become an absolute icon: physique, strength, symmetry, stage presence. But he never found the right path to turn those strengths into lasting worldwide recognition. Even so, his 5 Mr. Universe titles remain a monument to who he truly was. Few bodybuilders in the sport's history managed to achieve that level of consistency. Those trophies prove that Edward didn't just compete, he dominated. They tell the story of a champion who, when he was in the right environment, was nearly unbeatable. And that's exactly what makes his fading legacy feel so unjust. Now that you know the full journey of Edward Kawak, it's impossible not to feel a mix of admiration and sadness. We admire his strength, his incredible physique, his almost superhuman discipline. But we also feel the weight of his fading legacy, the injustice, and the choices that forever changed the course of his life. And that's precisely why stories like his need to continue being told, so that great names don't disappear into silence, and so the legacy of these athletes is never lost to time. If this video touched you in any way, I want to ask you for something simple, but incredibly important. Hit the like button. It tells YouTube that this content deserves to reach more people and helps keep the memory of these bodybuilding giants alive. And if you want to support our work even further, consider becoming a channel member. Now I want to hear from you. What stood out the most in Edward Kawak's journey? Do you believe he could have been a real contender for the Mr. Olympia title if he had joined the IFBB at the right moment? Or do you think backstage politics would have blocked him no matter what? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read everything with care, and your voice is part of this community we're building together. And of course, if you're not subscribed yet, this is the perfect moment to join our family. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of the upcoming videos in our Bodybuilding's Fallen Heroes playlist. This series exists because you're here, watching, commenting, and helping this project grow. And before you go, there's another video waiting for you on the end screen. It's just as powerful as this one and will definitely make you reflect even more on the hidden side of this sport. Click it now and come continue this journey with us. See you there.